think this is as good a shot as I'm going to get of the back of this quarter. Maybe you can read the top of the quarter there. It says Frederick Douglass, and that is who the picture is of, and that is his Washington, D.C. house. In the background, he's sitting at a desk writing. Unfortunately, it's not as clear as the Susan B. Anthony dollar picture was on this video, but I wanted to show this. I found this quarter, and I didn't know. All the quarterbacks these days, I have no idea. They're all completely different, related to American history, but not like predictable like the states in order of statehood. So I was surprised to find this. This is from 2017, and I think I will not put it with my quarter collection, but keep it in my wallet with the Susan B. Anthony dollar. I can have Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass both in my wallet with me at all times, and never spend either of them. I think that the Susan B. Anthony dollar, maybe not the one currently in my wallet, but the one of my Susan B. Anthony dollars I received in change because the person thought it was a quarter. So I paid, I think, $1 for 50 cents. The book was 50 cents at a library sale. I paid $1, and I got essentially $1.50 in change, or something like that. I forget exactly the math, but the quarter, Frederick Douglass. The themes for today's video. The past 4 weeks have been Black History Month, and for the first time really since school, I specifically laid out time over the course of the month to learn some Black history, which is not to say that I don't do it throughout the year, which is why I have rarely actually concentrated on it during Black History Month. I try to, learn it throughout the year, whenever opportunity strikes. When I have the opportunity to borrow the autobiography of Malcolm X, that's when I'll do it. I won't say, well, it's not February, so I won't do it. But there are some books that I've been meaning to read for a long time that I read this month. There are some books that I read in college that I reread this month. The only two books I think that I still have from college, the ones that made the biggest impression on me at the time and which I thought were the most useful to keep around. And I'll start with those books. The one I'm currently reading, Trumpet by Jackie Kay, is about a transgender trumpet player, jazz trumpet player, Scottish, named Joss Moody, who is based on the transgender jazz pianist Billy Tipton. And most of the book deals with the aftermath of this person's death and how everyone except the spouse, who knew that Joss Moody was transgender, deals with finding out, including his son. I haven't finished it yet. I'm hoping to finish it by the end of the day, and then I will write about it for the blog with more thoughts. It is heavily based on what happened to Billy Tipton. So there's this one, Jackie Kay, Black British writer, and this one, Cane by Jean Toomer, a very curious piece of literature. It's part, well, for one thing, it's part some of its illustration. Well, okay, so here's 2 pages in the middle. They are poems. But then, the very next page, a short story. And toward the end here, essentially, a play. And it's in 3 sections, which are divided by mostly blank pages with arcs. This one has 2. I think most of them have 3, or have 1. And the very first page of mine must have been sloppily or misprinted. So the professor at the time told us where and what angle to draw, and so we drew it in if we had this edition. Alice Walker here on the title. Cain has been reverberating in me to an astonishing degree. I love it passionately, could not possibly exist without it. It is considered a pivotal book in Black literature, and it was one of the most significant contributions to the Harlem Renaissance. And it's kind of like Trumpet, but to a more extreme degree, written very poetically. So I have trouble with the language. I do better with straightforward narrative, prose type, and whether it's prose or not, it can still be poetic. So more straightforward language I do better with. But that's one of the reasons that I kept it, was that I don't feel like I've fully gotten into it. And I think I did better this time. I'm a better reader. I understand more of the history, but still, it remains a challenge to me. And he is a curious figure, because even though he was considered such a significant part of the Harlem Renaissance, such an important Black voice, he presented as and considered himself white. He had Black heritage. His either great-grandfather, I can look that up quickly because it's worth looking up, and because I can very quickly get to it because I've been reading about him. His mother's father, so his grandfather, was P.B.S. Pinchback, and he was one of the first Black men to be elected to the Senate, although he never served in the Senate, and I don't know why. But so that's Gene Toomer's heritage. But and you can look him up to see pictures. He presented as white, and he considered himself white. He didn't want to be he was called at the time the Black Savior, the artist who will lead Black artists and Black people to a new, well, that's what the Harlem Renaissance was, to new realizations of themselves through art, and furthering causes of bringing them up to more equal levels with white people. And he didn't want that burden. And I happened to be reading this at the same time, the first time in college, at the time that Barack Obama was on the rise, and people were saying essentially the same things about him, except while he wouldn't have used the word savior to describe himself, he was more willing to, okay, people are invested in me, and I want to give them something. Gene Toomer didn't want to be relied upon in that way. Actually, on my blog, I won't share the links below, but you'll be able to get them. I'll share the link to what I wrote about this book below, and then the links are in there to one of the first pieces of kind of journalism that I wrote in college for Mint magazine, was comparing Barack Obama and how he was acting in response to everyone saying, this guy's the big guy, this guy's our savior, and how Gene Toomer reacted. And I'm much more, at the time, I was more steeped in Toomer because of the class that I was taking, and so it probably makes more sense what I wrote back then than what I'm saying right now. But it also smacks of, this was written by a college student trying to be a journalist, trying to make meaning. So excuse the childishness of it, but it's interesting, so do read it. But most of my time spent reading this month has been these 3 books. Because, again, as I said, I've had them on my bookshelf for a long time. I love reading the memoirs of Civil War figures. This one is not a memoir, I found out. I assumed it was. And also, of course, being from Rochester and hearing all about them frequently, and I'm still reading. You can see it right there, the giant Frederick Douglass biography that was new a couple years ago. I should be able to get through it by the end of the month. I'm reading it 10 pages at a time, just as a reminder. That's why it's taking me so long to read it. But I read these straight through, and I'll start with this one. It was interesting to be reading his memoir, this is the big one, not the narrative that I read in, I think, middle school and or high school and or college, possibly. This is, and that one where he obscured details about his life so that he couldn't be found. This one, all the names are there. I think I've mentioned in a video before, the guy who owned him, first name was Aaron, disturbing for me, but necessarily disturbing for me. And also, as it says up here, Runaway Slave who became Abraham Lincoln's advisor and consul general to Haiti. He was a U.S. Marshal, all sorts of things I didn't know. I knew he escaped from slavery, he lived in Rochester, he had a newspaper, and he spoke around the country. I didn't know the vast majority about his life. So it was, and one of the reasons that I haven't read the book is because it's thick and I'm getting braver about reading these things, but the 800-page thing behind me, I read it 10 pages at a time. This is somewhere between where I'm comfortable reading it straight through and where I insist I'm going to read it a little bit at a time, but I read it straight through. It is so beautifully written, and it's a memoir. It's a memoir written in the 19th century. It's not as honest, as explicit as the biography is. The guy is not David Blight. David Blight is not embarrassed on behalf of Frederick Douglass. He's sharing everything to create a complete picture of the historical figure. But memoirs, what he was comfortable, what Frederick Douglass himself was comfortable writing about and sharing, and especially being able to compare it to the flat, cold facts. I felt like, with memoirs, I feel like I get to know the person, even though they've been dead for so long. And he was so, especially in the latter half of the book, but throughout, he was so optimistic. I felt more patriotic reading this book than I do reading most books, and than I do in general. It's not that I don't love the country, it's just that that's not something that I feel on a constant basis, and not just because of the way things are at this moment in time. But reading this book, he just, in spite of everything, loved the country, was optimistic about the future, and even if I hadn't already resolved to put this up on the shelf with the Elizabeth Cady Stanton books or the Susan B. Anthony books, it would have won me over just from the beauty of the writing, learning about things like when he was giving his lectures about having escaped slavery and the horrors of slavery. He was essentially told what a lot of black actors say that they hear in auditions: you're not acting black enough. It's not believable that you're an escaped slave. You're too articulate, stuff like that. And the kind of eye roll, most of it's very optimistic and positive, but the kind of eye roll through the language that he used describing that, and obviously it was painful to be told something like that, but the way that he talks about it is just lets you know it's kind of a sigh. It's kind of a, this was never going to be easy, and it's still not going to be easy. That I'm going to have to deal with this kind of thing. So definitely, especially if and this made me more curious to go back and read the 100-page version that gets assigned to grade school students. So I'll have to find that now. I think maybe I once had it, but when I was getting rid of books from college that were not Kane or Trumpet, it probably got swept up in that. And also I assumed something like that I can find anytime at a library sale. So read that, read this, get to know the historical figures. He didn't know when his birthday was, but he celebrated it on Valentine's Day, which is the day before Susan B. Anthony's birthday. And I wonder if that had anything to do with it, considering they did know each other, they were friends. Apparently, they were not as close as I was telling people for 2 years, giving tours of the Susan B. Anthony House. And I look forward to learning more about exactly that. Oh, and one more thing that I may have mentioned in a previous video. Famously, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had racist feelings. They said things. They used racist caricatures, and they said them on occasion to and about him, even though they were friends. And it was especially around the time when the Reconstruction Amendments were happening, and they wanted, while the Constitution is being amended, let's include women in the vote. Don't just give it to black men. Give it to black men, black women, and white women. The people who need it. All the people who need it who don't yet have it. And when he did not support that, that's when, most famously, when the racist rhetoric came out. And what I noticed reading that biography in this book, he does not seem to have been sexist. He didn't have prejudices. They were raised with prejudices against black people. He was raised with only one prejudice, and it was that he was inferior, and that is why he's a slave. There was no reason to instill other prejudices in slaves. They just have to believe that they themselves are inferior. And once, as he writes here, as others have written, once they break that, once they get past that, if they can, and it's a difficult thing to get past, that's when escape becomes possible, and that's when you become optimistic for the future, which is what he was. But he's still arguably, I mean, there's no way of knowing how I would have felt at the time, what the sentiment was at the time. If he had read the next book that I'm going to talk about, he might have had a different take on how urgent it was that women also have the right to vote. He said it's much more urgent that black men have the right to vote than that any women do, because they're in more danger. But if he had experienced what Harriet Jacobs experienced, then he might have had a different opinion about that. And I'm not sure if his opinion alone would have, been enough to actually get it through, but that he would have been on the same side as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Harriet Jacobs. This book is not, the Frederick Douglass book is about his whole life up to the point that he was writing it, which was toward the end of his life. This is about the period in her life when she fled slavery, and I have no idea. It's not like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman where you hear a lot about Harriet Jacobs. I had no idea about most of this. I didn't know where this book was going to go, what she had done that warranted her being a historical figure. But learning to read and write as a slave, escaping, writing your own memoir, recounting what it's like. And when she originally wrote it, this novel has a cast list, which I did not consult, but show it to you. Because, like Frederick Douglass did in his first narrative, she obscured the true identities of the people in her story to protect her from being found. She published this. Slavery was still a thing. People were still hunting escaped slaves. And she didn't want anyone to know, to be able to identify her. And, I don't know how this would have read if I had read it before the Me Too movement, because the plot turns, her life turned on when she became a teenager, when she started to develop and become womanly in her shape, and her master came after her. And at least as written here, as she represents her story, she did not actually get raped. It was all advances, and which not good, but considering the power that he did have over her legally and in so many other ways, a miracle that he didn't follow through. But it was just the advances, it was just the threat that drove her to, at first it wasn't really running away. She she hid for a long time in the basement or in some kind of crawl space at her friend's, at the house of her friend. I think it was a white friend. Um, and well, I wasn't exactly clear on that ever, because sometimes it seemed like she was never, I don't think, at her grandmother's house, but I was never exactly sure where, whose house she was hiding in. It just constantly reminded me of Anne Frank. And whereas Frederick Douglass escapes and he goes north and he's gone and he's essentially free but still in danger, she escapes, but she's stuck there in the same town, living in the home of someone who knows her master, and who her master comes to and says, "Do you know anything?" constantly. Uh, and so you see, whereas Frederick Douglass, he escaped. It's all his story. We're in his mind and seeing the things he saw and where he is. Same thing here, except where she is back where all the aftermath is happening. We see firsthand the reaction of the owner, and just how insane he became. How it seemed finding her and regaining power over her became the driving force of his life, and I would have found it too cartoony, again, in another time. But just like the Me Too movement changed probably how I read the advances and how creepy that was, and the power dynamic and all of that, the the Brett Kavanaugh hearings changed how I looked at uh, her owner, and how he would always dodge around the idea of selling her because, oh well, she technically didn't belong to him, she was willed to his daughter, who was a minor child and wasn't dealing with. And I kept always went, well, where is the daughter? What does the little girl have to say if she actually owns? But that didn't ultimately matter, because he only used that as an excuse. That's not how he actually saw things. But the way that Brett Kavanaugh reacted to people questioning his suitability to be a Supreme Court justice, people questioning him as a human being, and bringing up very real things that I don't think he definitely didn't convince people that the things that he was accused of, the blackout drunk stuff, the sexual assault, he didn't convince anybody that he hadn't done that. It's just that the system worked in his favor, because the system still does. But how I rewatched recently Matt Damon's Saturday Night Live caricature, and it was so close to the actual thing. It was so weird watching him dissolve on television. And again, if it weren't for that, I would have found the way that her master reacted to her running away unrealistic. But anything goes now as far as that sort of thing is concerned. And also, she has to watch her children grow up, constantly worrying about them from the crawl space in her friend's house. It's a very different. The books really complement each other. His narrative about escaping, going north, and starting to make his life at that point, and her narrative about escaping but not really escaping, and having to watch everything that happened after she eventually does escape and go north, and her children get to go with her. I think they all arrive separately, but the family is gone. The family is all up north. The children, by the way, of her and a different white man who I guess she actually was in love with, but it's still the power dynamic. It's still not the way that it should be. Who tried to buy her on the promise to her and to her friends that he would free her if he bought her, and I'm not so sure he was so being honest about that based on later behavior. But even after her master knew that she had been with another man, another white man, and that she had children with him, he was still just obsessed with, well, I can still get her in my power again. And so, complementary books, the two escaped slave personal narrative memoirs, that are considered the models of what genre there is. I'm not sure how many others there are, but definitely things, and I didn't know this because I didn't know anything about her. I didn't know what his memoir was going to be like, but definitely things to be read together if you can get them together, and definitely things to be read just to understand on such an intimate level about these things that happened hundreds of years ago but still have repercussions today. And those two being memoirs are why I assumed that this was a memoir. And I also assumed it because this is so small down here. It says Harriet Tubman, huge, and she's such a big deal historical figure that I assumed she had, like Frederick Douglass, had written her own memoir, but she was more like Susan B. Anthony to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton kind of did a lot more of the writing and staying put. Susan B. Anthony did a lot more of the traveling, and also was the one who went out and did the illegal thing of voting, which is not quite comparable to escaping slavery and freeing other slaves, which was an illegal thing at the time, technically. But Susan B. Anthony also didn't leave a memoir. But Susan B. Anthony could read and write, which Harriet Tubman never could. And I assumed that she could. I guess I lumped her together with Frederick Douglass. I assumed that anyone who escaped slavery and became a historical figure who was black at that time must have been able to read and write, but she couldn't. And which is why at one time she is, it says her friends and colleagues found her asleep on a park bench underneath a poster that said, "Wanted Harriet Tubman," by this description. It also provided for an amusing moment where she sees, I guess it was her former master, I wasn't quite clear on that, on a train or they're both passengers on something, and she sees him, and in order to disguise herself, she pretends to read a newspaper because he knew that she couldn't read, and it worked. And just it's these stories, these historical stories about slavery, are a mixture of the repulsive and the ridiculous, because of course it's horrible to read about the things, and I didn't talk about the more violent things that happened to Frederick Douglass, and I talked about Harriet Jacobs and the things that might have happened to her that would have been definitely more violent than what she did go through, which also wasn't, which was definitely not right in any way. But they also have just the ridiculousness of Frederick Douglass being told that he's not acting black enough, that he's not acting like a slave enough, and her just pretending to read, and that's enough to convince this guy who knew what she looked like that it wasn't her, because the real person couldn't read, so why would she even have a newspaper? I never realized, I knew that Harriet Tubman was associated with the Underground Railroad. I learned that in high school. She was, for a brief shining moment, scheduled to make an appearance on the front of the $20 bill, which I guess is a project that has been scrapped. And, pardon me, she has not a musical, but a jazz oratorio, which I'm currently listening to by Marcus Shelby. Which, being an oratorio and being jazz, I'm not the best equipped. It's kind of like poetic language. I'm not the best equipped to completely process and appreciate it, but I'm trying. So I knew she had all these things. I sometimes wondered, but other than that, other than the Underground Railroad thing, why is she a bigger deal than Frederick Douglass or other historical figures at the time? She was a superhero. This, again, not her memoir, not her autobiography, but a biography by Earl Conrad. He's written some other things that I'm going to try to read one day. This was for a long time the definitive biography of her. It was written in the 40s, and apparently he had trouble getting it published because it was more academic than previous and more based on truth and less on legend than previous things. But even though it was all more truth than legend, it wasn't just a matter of the escaped slaves would come to her and she would send them on to the next place, which I didn't understand these things. I hadn't delved deep. I knew what I learned in basic history courses. She went to and from. She took them. She took them the whole way. She had elaborate deceptions. She would disguise herself. She would sing in a certain way that indicated, oh, it's safe to come out. It's not safe to come out. And just she was a superhero. And which is why I guess she gets a movie in this age when superhero movies are the thing. She's the one of these three people who got her own movie. Frederick Douglass appears in the movie Glory, and reading his memoir and reading that biography gave me context for that, because that movie is about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which he helped bring about and he helped recruit. It was an all-black regiment, except for the commanding officers. So now I was eager to see the movie anyway. I'm a fan of Cynthia Erivo. I have not seen her live on Broadway yet, but I'm hoping to eventually. I'm very excited for what she could do now. Her star is still on the rise, but it's pretty high, but it's still on the rise, and I'm, looking forward to eventually seeing what she does. More movies I've seen. A couple of her movies haven't been my favorite movies. I saw the heist one, and I saw what was the other one? It had Thor in it. Bad Times at the El Royale, and Widows was the heist one. And it looks like she's in The Outsider on HBO, which I will eventually get around to because it's based on Stephen King, and my roommate loves Stephen King. But mostly she sang The Impossible Dream at the Kennedy Center as part of a Kennedy Center honors, I think it was, and I love playing that clip. So I'm looking forward to more of her and learning more about Harriet Tubman. There are newer biographies now, probably more thorough than this. I liked it as a primer, and it definitely taught me more than I already knew about her, but it didn't have the "it's like I'm there" detail of the Prophet of Destiny, Frederick Douglass biography, or the intimacy, and I feel like I'm getting to know you as a person and what you want to reveal, as the memoirs had. So it was kind of in between. I'm going to keep it, but it's more like the beginning, and it's the beginning with all of them. I'll learn more about all of them, but with this one, it really felt more like I need to, not just I want to, but I need to get more, and not just the movie version. Although I'm looking forward to that. It should be streaming soon, somewhere, or maybe I'll rent it. So those are. And just to reassure anyone who might think, well, you spent your first Black History Month in which you concentrated on Black people reading about, mostly about escaped slaves. And that is true. But like I said, I try not to just, concentrate all of my Black people stuff into Black History Month, just the 1 month, the shortest month, even at 29 days this year. Over the course of the rest of this year, for instance, I will be reading for the first time Maya Angelou. I get that book. It's right here. It's my next one. I've got Colson Whitehead. I've got the plays of Will Shrienka and August Wilson. I will be reading Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, which I'm looking forward to, especially since I was at the bookstore Giovanni's Room in Philadelphia. What else? I might read Barack Obama's books this year. It depends on how I'm feeling about presidential politics, but his books are wonderful. I've read them in 2007 when I was still not quite in the bag for Hillary then. And he should have a book coming out at some point. He's got to write his presidential memoir. So his books, and those are just the people whose names I remember. I'm not going to do a similar thing for Women's History Month. I'm going to read The Secret History of Wonder Woman and the memoir of Maria von Trapp, or Maria Augusta Trapp, which is the basis for The Sound of Music. At least their story is. I don't know if the memoir came before or after the musical did. Probably before. But my reading of books by women is not as spotty as my reading of books by Black people. So I don't... So the latter part of March will be Easter and Lent themed, Last Temptation of Christ, and a book about the creation of the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. and hopefully eventually The Wizard of Oz, because I found the DVD The Wizard of Oz at a library sale, and that's one of the like holy grail treasures that I've been looking for. As far as DVDs that I feel like I gotta have, because The Wizard of Oz isn't going to stream anywhere probably, and it's rarely on TV and only seems on cable. I've never, since I moved to New York and I don't have cable, I haven't seen that movie. In fact, I probably haven't seen it since high school or at least college. So finding it on DVD, I can read The Wizard of Oz, and then I can watch the Wizard of Oz movie and the Wiz movie back to back, and that'll be fun. But in closing, and while we're on musicals, over the course of this month, I posted on Facebook and Twitter favorite YouTube clips of musicals featuring Black performers, and often but not always, in fact, probably the minority of them doing material written by Black people, but sometimes. Cynthia Erivo doing The Impossible Dream, I used that so that I could use the original Broadway cast Tony performance clip of The Color Purple. She was, of course, in the revival of The Color Purple. I'm going to post a few below. The last 3 days, I was always like, I saved Audra McDonald for last because she's the big one. And I thought, well, which one am I going to do? And so I decided to just do the last 3 days, give Audra McDonald a representation proportional to her importance. She is one of the top Broadway divas performers of any race, and gender for that matter. She's one of the most important Broadway performers ever. I think she holds the record for most performance Tonys, and I think she recently broke the record that was previously held by Angela Lansbury. I think that's how it happened. I saw her in Porgy and Bess, and her singing Summertime is one of the clips that I'd picked, but I also have her singing for Barack Obama at the White House, and I have her at Sondheim's 80th birthday celebration singing The Glorious Life. And I'm going to link to a few highlights from that list. I was very happy with not only I got to watch them, but also coming up with them. And, some are from movies like Queen Latifah in Chicago, or Paul Robeson in Showboat. Paul Robeson, also from Rochester, I'm pretty sure. So I'll be posting highlights, including Andre de Shields, who was the original Wiz in The Wiz. He's not in the movie. Richard Pryor plays the Wiz in the movie, I think. And he's singing So You Wanted to Meet the Wizard, one of my favorite songs from The Wiz, but 40 years later at the 40th anniversary celebration. And I have Titus Burgess singing You're Gonna Love Me, or I think it's called And I'm Telling You, from Dreamgirls, which I recently watched the DVD of. Great movie. I hope to see it live on stage one day. It seems like the kind of thing that you want musicals. You want to see musicals live on stage. And so I definitely want to see it live on stage eventually. It's from the Broadway Backwards Gender Flipped performance, which is a benefit concert for Broadway Cares, I'm pretty sure. Let's see, there was one other that I wanted to specifically say, but I will, of course, share all of these. Not all of them. I'm not going to share all 29 videos, but one of the Audra McDonalds and the Titus Burgess and the Andre de Shields, and maybe others, and there are more. I realized late, and so I kind of did an extra bonus one. My first one was Norm Lewis, who was the first Black man to play the Phantom on Broadway. I shared a clip of him singing Music of the Night to Sierra Boggess, I think is how to pronounce her name. But I forgot to look up, and I'm not going to pronounce his name right, but he played Rafiki. He voiced Rafiki in the original animated Lion King, Robert Guillaume. And he was never on Broadway as the Phantom, but he was the first Black man to play the Phantom shortly after Michael Crawford left the Los Angeles production. And so I found a clip. I didn't know that clips existed of him singing Music of the Night. I found a clip. I shared it. And there are multiple clips of him singing Music of the Night. So I'll share that too. It was great to look them up. Most of them I knew they existed. Some of them came as a surprise, like the Titus Burgess one. And so it was a nice, I figured as long as I'm devoting my reading, I should kind of go back to my 366 days, 366 musicals thing and post a different musical performer every day for this month. And again, it's not the same with women. It's hard to not find a clip of a woman singing a prominent musical theater part. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. There will be links to the videos and things below. I'm going to finish the book Trumpet, and I will eventually have that blog post up. I'll have blog posts about each of these. And if you want a little fun, I wrote song parodies, primary voting themed song parodies for Iowa and Nevada, and I'm hoping this weekend to do South Carolina, and then I'll do one for Super Tuesday, and maybe I'll keep doing this because it's fun, and but I won't link to them. Go to my blog to find them. It's just a bit of fun. So let's see. I think that's going to be it. And not just wearing this because Obama is a significant Black historical figure, but the idea one voice can change the world. This is from his 2008 campaign, I think, and that is the point of all of these books, really. These voices changed the world. And each of them is only one voice. And sure, they are together. They are more than one voice, but still. They each changed the world in their own way. As mentioned, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, very different ways to escape slavery. Harriet Tubman didn't leave a memoir, and so far as I know, didn't leave much in the way of words. Probably there are some speeches, there is the occasional quote in this book, but much like Frederick Douglass said, he prayed and prayed to escape slavery and didn't escape till he prayed with his feet. That's how she spoke. That was her voice. She changed the world by making a statement with her feet, with her arms, with her body, throwing it back and forth across the Mason-Dixon line, and she spoke that way. Gene Toomer wasn't sure what his voice specifically was, but he still used it, and what it meant to him and what it meant to others. He wasn't that's murky, but he used it the way he did to tell stories, and that changed the world. And Jackie Kay elevated and more gracefully than the press that covered Billy Tipton's death used her voice to explore what back in the 90s, what transgender people went through, what their relationships were like, and how fair or unfair certain kinds of people, press, family, etc., were to them. And so it's one of my favorite shirts. So I don't have a Frederick Douglass clip as iconic as Susan B. Anthony's, so I'm going to sign off with the same one I did last time and just say failure is impossible.